Welcome to B2B Marketers on a Mission, a podcast for B2B marketers that helps you to question the conventional, think differently, disrupt your industry, and take your marketing to new heights. Each week, we talk to B2B marketing experts who share inspirational stories, discuss their thoughts on trending topics, and provide useful marketing tips and recommendations. And now, here's your host and co-founder of Untitled Consulting, Kathryn Strachen. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the B2B Marketers on a Mission podcast, where you get your weekly dose of B2B marketing insights. This is your host, Kathryn Strachen, and today I am joined by someone on a mission to empower technology brands to challenge the status quo. So, Kathryn Strachen, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's great to be connected, Kathryn, and I really love how, like in our previous conversation, we started going down this path, talking about where you were originally from in Maine, and that kind of led to these conversations about these different Stephen King novels. Makes it interesting.
Yeah, Stephen King, he's from my home state and actually taught at the university where I did my undergraduate. So, I'm a big Stephen King fan.
Yeah, you made that very clear in the last conversation. So that was great. That was super original. But yeah, look, I'm really looking forward to this conversation because there are so many things we're going to talk about today that are going to be so relevant to the audience of this show. So let's get started. Huh?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So you're a subject matter expert, I'm going to say, when it comes to the topic of technology content across AI, blockchain, and fintech. But for this conversation, let's narrow it down to how to develop B2B content that creates conversations and builds relationships. So talk to us about the role that you believe the right B2B content plays in those conversations and relationships.
Yeah, definitely. So traditionally, B2B copywriting is known for being dull and dry and jargon heavy. And I think that's mostly because it lacks empathy. If you are trying to talk to a company as a company and not as a human to human, then you are, approaching it with a very straight back and, without any sort of personality or empathy or emotions or anything like this. But one of the things that's happened over the last couple of years, and has certainly been accelerated by the pandemic, is the awareness that actually in these companies are people. And as a company, even a B2B company, you are working with a human. There is maybe certainly a decision chain within the company, but you're still working with humans who have stresses and emotions and, pain points and, need reassurance that you're the right partner for them. And I think, that's definitely one thing that the pandemic has brought out is this awareness of working directly with humans, even in B2B, who have specific pain points and needs. So, B2B copywriting for me should be about understanding those needs. It should be about understanding those pain points and making sure that all the messages that go out support your audience in the way that they want to be supported. So, it's about having meaningful conversations. And by having meaningful conversations, you start to build trust and loyalty and eventually drive conversions. So it is about, creating those important conversations, and especially in the tech landscape, some of this emerging tech, it's new, it's scary, it's unknown. People generally don't like the unknown because it seems risky. And, quite often this technology isn't risky. It's actually perhaps safer than the current solution that they're using, but they don't know that if you don't talk to them, if you don't tell them. So, to me, if you're not creating content, you're basically not having conversations with your audience. And if you're not having conversations with your audience, I can guarantee you that somebody else is.
Amen to that, right? No, you brought up some really great points. And, these are points also that I've read in different articles online, right? And, you talked about certain things like, for example, making it relatable to the target audience, right? And to your point that you mentioned earlier, if you're talking about something in the field of tech and it becomes extremely, well, for lack of a better description, technical, extremely filled with jargon, it's going to really be hard to make that piece of content relatable. So to your point, it begs the question, well, how do you break that down in a way that it resonates with somebody who might not be someone with a technical background, right? Because there are, and I think this was also your point, there are other people within that ecosystem in your client's company that probably should be reading this content. And I go a step further to say they could benefit actually from reading that content.
Yes, 100%. I mean, even when you're speaking to C-suite, there's still a knowledge gap because
Yeah.
C-suite, CTO has a general understanding of technology, but they are not going to know blockchain the way that somebody who built it is. And I think this is probably one of the biggest mistakes that B2B companies and technology companies make, is that they think that the content should be created in-house by the subject matter expert. But it actually shouldn't, because that subject matter expert who's been working in the field for 10, 20 years knows it so well that they don't know what other people don't know. So they write it for themselves. They write it for somebody who's been working in it for decades and understands it to that degree. So they'll use a word, a jargon term, something like that, without properly explaining it. And, somebody who has decades of experience, sure, knows what that word is. But somebody from the outside, even C-suite, may not. So what you get is you get this knowledge gap. And, one of the things I always say that we do is that we help to bridge that knowledge gap. So the value of working with an external person like an agency is that we can take the complex messages from the subject matter expert and translate it to their audience in a way that their audience is going to understand. We basically help our clients see the woods from the trees, and when you're in-house and when you don't have that perspective, you end up in a bit of an echo chamber and you end up creating content just for yourself. But you are normally not the audience that you're trying to sell to or connect with or build those relationships. So, I mean, it's a bit like going on a first date and only talking about yourself. Even if you're dating the perfect person in the world, they aren't going to be interested because you didn't ask them any questions about them. You didn't think about them at all. You just sat there for a whole dinner and just talked about yourself.
That was the perfect analogy. And, certainly we've never come across that in our, past experience with dating, have we? Running
No,
into somebody
never.
that is, well, for lack of a better description, narcissistic.
Yeah.
You brought up such a great point, and I just wanted to go back to it about this bridging that gap, and I think it goes back to this. It's an overused term, but it also highlights a reality that many companies are facing. It's this operating or functioning in silos, where they're moving and operating in a world where all of this stuff that they do makes sense. So because in their world it makes sense, if they take it to market, then for sure it's going to make sense to everybody else. And then leads to the big disappointment when they're like, well, wait, hang on, how come they don't understand it? Right. And you brought up another point, which was a great segue into the next question about common mistakes. And I'd like to go back to that one about everything shouldn't be done in house, is what you said, right? So I'm pretty sure there's a camp out there that might disagree with that point, but just talk to us a little bit more about some other mistakes that you've seen out there when it comes to B2B content.
Yeah, I mean, on that first mistake, I think the best content comes from a collaboration between in-house and external. I mean, we all need external perspectives. If you spent no time talking to anybody ever, the world you would live in would be a very strange world indeed. Humans don't exist in isolation, and neither do brands. We need to have those conversations. We need to speak to others in the industry, and we need to have an external perspective to help guide us and make sure that we're on course. So, I don't want to say that there's no role for in-house, because there is, but it's about collaborating with an external party who can help give that perspective, who can help make sure that you're on the right course and that the messages that you send make sense to your audience. I mean, that's certainly one of the biggest mistakes. I mean, another really big mistake, as I kind of mentioned earlier, is not understanding the audience and not not delivering any emotion or personality in B2B content. I mean, B2B copywriting has a really bad rep for being that dry and dull and boring, which, it doesn't have to be and it doesn't need to be. And I think, also B2B companies sometimes, quite often I get this question, when I'm talking about customer avatars, customer personas, B2B brands ask me, do I still need that in B2B? And, I'm like, yes, of course you do. You definitely need to know who your audience is. You definitely need to know what's keeping them awake at night, because, I can almost guarantee you that the things that are keeping somebody awake at night are work related and aren't personally related. Most of us, the last time I was awake at night, I was thinking about work. I wasn't thinking about my personal life. So, those stresses are even higher in the B2B environment. So not paying attention to emotions, not understanding your audience, not thinking about it from a meaningful perspective is a massive mistake. I mean, another big mistake that tends to stem from all of that as well is, especially technology companies will focus on the features of what their product does. So, and I understand, if you spend years building the specific feature that, is the fastest on the market, you are very proud of it. So you want to talk about that. But what they fail to do is think about the benefit that it brings. So why does it matter? Why does it matter that this is the fastest on the market? What is it going to do for the user that, no other product can? Is it perhaps saving them time so they can spend more time on more meaningful tasks, or even outside of work with loved ones? I mean, what value is it going to bring to somebody's life? So, I mean, that's a massive mistake that a lot of tech companies make is, they focus on the features rather than the benefits. But when you have that foundational understanding of who you're talking to, of what they need, what they're worried about, and when you approach content from an empathetic point of view, that naturally starts to shift as well.
Yeah, no, those are some really great points. Now, I wanted to go back to something you said earlier with regards to customer avatars and understanding who it is that you're talking to, right? Why do you think, at least also from what I've observed in the world of B2B, why do you think there are some companies out there that want to skip that part? Is it a combination of them not understanding what it is, and them feeling that they don't need it? Like if if I don't know what it is, then I probably don't need it. Or is it or is it also because of they're in a bit of a time crunch, so they feel that going through that process of developing those avatars is time consuming and they need something like yesterday?
I think there's probably a few reasons, and it probably depends on the company.
Sure.
But, I think it comes from the old school way of thinking about B2B and, thinking about it as selling to a company rather than to a person. It's quite a relatively new concept to think about it as selling to a human within an organization rather than selling to a company. You don't need a customer avatar if you're selling to enterprises that, and only thinking about them as an enterprise and not as, a collection of humans, which, of course, we know that they are. I think, traditionally the world of work, your personal life and your professional life were very separate. So, there was a very clear divide. And one of the things that is happening with the new way of working, and that has been accelerated by the pandemic, is, this realization that we are human at work as well as at home. So, you see companies starting to understand this and, give more flexibility and, flexibility around start and end times and ways of working and, all of these things. And that flexibility comes from understanding that, your personal life doesn't go away when you go to work, that you don't step through the door and suddenly not have any emotions, which it's never been true. It's never been true that you go to work and don't have any emotions, but it did used to be approached that way. It did used to be seen as, that you weren't supposed to have any emotions at work. So, why would a marketing manager need to know about the emotions that their audience might have if they're selling B2B? But I think it's just a very outdated, old school way of thinking. And, the smartest companies, the most innovative companies are embracing the idea of the full human, of taking care of their employees' needs, both in and out, in work and outside of work. And, that should extend to your audience as well, because it is all about building relationships. And you can't just build a relationship with the person who they are just in their specific role. I mean, we don't do that with our coworkers. We don't do that with our employees. So why would we do that with our customers, with our clients?
I love what you said earlier, embracing the full human. That sounds like a campaign strap line. You can propose that one to to one of your clients. But no, great points, and I think it goes back to something a lot of people have been saying, that B2B, especially B2B copywriting, has become, or in the past was notorious for being very dry and very like, okay, fact and information based. And I think the end result of that is something that we've all come to know and avoid, is then it then everything just drowns in the sea of sameness, right? And it's just really hard for a B2B brand, if they're in that sea of sameness, then to stand out. And the way to stand out are back to those things that you were saying, right? Making it more relatable, adding that human element to it, like behind that, who is behind that technology, right? Who is working
Yeah.
on this stuff, right?
100%. I mean, I always use the example of, say you're in a crowded room, there's 1,000 people in the room, and you're going, hey, everybody, hey, everybody, hey, everybody. Nobody will turn around and look at you. It's a bit like the guy in the street trying to hand out flyers to every single person who walks by. How many people do you think actually take that flyer and do anything with it? But if you go, hey, guy in the blue shirt, or hey woman, with the red hair, then all the people who meet that description are going to turn around and look at you because they think you're talking to them. The guy in the blue shirt thinks that you're talking to him because he's wearing a blue shirt. So by creating really hyper personalized content that speaks directly to one person, you cut through the noise. They pay attention because they think you're talking to them. So they gravitate towards your brand. They're far more likely to engage with you. You stand out because you understand them. You know what they want and what they need, and you're talking directly to them. I mean, that's why we've seen a big rise as well in, very niche products and positioning. Long gone I think are the days of general service providers, a general agency. I do a lot of networking, and I meet, 50 people every single month. And one of the things that I definitely notice is when somebody tells me, oh, we're a full service digital marketing agency that works across all industries. The first thing I think is, well, what do I do with that? Who do I introduce you to? What projects do I send your way? I don't know. But when somebody says to me, we do content marketing for technology and fintech companies, using our positioning there, I know exactly what to do with that. I know who to send their way. I know who to connect them to. I know who to introduce them to. It's very clear. As humans, we have to make thousands of decisions every single day. So we've gotten very good at compartmentalizing and making these quick snap decisions. And, in order to do that, you need the right information. And by giving people the right information, they can then know, okay, you are the service provider for me, or you're not the service provider for me. And they can make those quick decisions. And they can also, point you in the right direction. So, perhaps actually somebody they know is a better fit for you than they are. But it's really about having that clear positioning and standing out from the crowd by knowing exactly who you are and what you do and who you do it for.
Absolutely. And that was such a great example. I think back in my day when I was in the agency side, they used to call it like integrated marketing communications, which I think was industry talk for, we're not entirely sure who we're going after, or what we specialize in. So let's just put everything under one roof, right?
The scattergun approach.
Exactly. Or just, like, use whatever analogy you wish, right? Like casting that net out there and then just hoping something gets caught in the net, right? And then pulling it back, as opposed to like going spear fishing in a lagoon. Right.
Yeah, but the problem with that as well is, when you throw a big net out there, you're going to get a lot of stuff you don't want. So
Right.
you throw a big net into the ocean, and you're probably going to get some garbage. But if you
For
take
sure.
that spearhead, you can go after the fish that you specifically want. So, I
Yeah.
mean, that's another value of having that really clear positioning is you attract the people that you want to work with instead of, attracting people who perhaps don't align with what you do and what you do well, and, don't align with who you want to work with, and actually end up making your life miserable, because a bad client is a false economy. You spend so much time trying to make them happy that you end up losing money on that project or on that product. It's far more efficient to work with the people that you can actually help, to work with the people who actually get the value of what you do, and that are aligned in that way. And you can only really be aligned if to begin with, uh, who you are and what you do and who you do it for.
You are so full of great expressions today. I think you're giving away your craft. Like a bad client is a false economy. I mean, that one, that one is so true. And I think that we've all experienced that at some point, haven't we?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, they drag down your team, they make company morale go down, they, drag out resources, and
Yeah,
yeah, end up
everything.
costing you more than they're worth when,
Everything.
like, you could swap them for a client that, probably pays about the same and
Or more.
is nice
Yeah.
and is enjoyable to work with, and that you actually can benefit from and that you actually get that value from. So, I mean, why would you not do that? I mean, we quite
Absolutely.
often get rid of clients that don't work for us.
Mhm.
I mean, I always remember when we get new account managers, our account managers are always super surprised when I tell them to just go ahead and fire that client, because they're so used to coming from an environment where it's all about keep the client happy at all costs. Absolutely anything you want, Mr. Client. But actually, in reality, they are a false economy. So we proactively break up with clients who don't get what we do or don't fit us quite right, or aren't nice to work with, because sometimes you can get the value of the service but aren't a nice person, and working with nice people is important.
Absolutely. But I mean, again, to your point, we are all products of the environments we grew up in, and in fact, the work environments that we found ourselves in. Right. So we were, I would say, in a conventional way, we were conditioned to please the client and do everything that the client wants, and without actually having to think about like uh, what kind of consequences that kind of mindset would actually have, not just to the individual, but to the company as a whole. But speaking of which, talking about challenges, talk to us about a challenge that you and your team have managed to solve in the past 12 months.
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest challenge probably comes around creating a content machine and getting that consistency, because, one of the important things about content is consistency. If you think about organic content, I always explain it a bit like packing a snowball at the top of the hill. You pack the snowball really tight and then you push it down the hill. And as it goes down the hill, it builds momentum and builds momentum until it becomes, a giant snowball. Now the problem is if there are stops and stalls along the way. So, if you don't get that consistent downhill, if you are constantly plateauing, it takes a lot more time to build that momentum than if you're able to, go consistently. So one of the things that we do at Coffee House is, we have dedicated project managers who control the system and create the system. And one of the things that we did that I'm quite proud of is about 10 months ago, we had a big client come to us who wanted to do 100 pieces of content a month. Now, that's quite a lot of content. It was justified for their industry because they are in the SaaS space. So, they're competing against other big software providers like Xero or Free Agent, who are giants and create a lot of content. So one of the things we really had to do was to to create that process and that system that would allow us to consistently deliver, 100 unique articles every single month. And, we ran that project for a 10-month sprint. And, the momentum that they were able to gain and the traction that they were able to get, the rankings on page one were just absolutely incredible. Drove so much organic momentum. We really put them on a very steep hill that took that small snowball, because they were starting from a standstill start, and turned it into a massive monster snowball within a very small space of time. So, that's quite an extreme example of how you can scale processes and systems to do something like that. But I think it's an important message for any company, even if you're only doing 4 a month. Consistency is key. To do 1 article 1 month and 0 the next and 5 the month after that is going to do you absolutely no good whatsoever. What you need to do is to create that consistency, to constantly produce content, because that's what, the market demands. It's what this Google search engine demands. And that's what your audience demands as well. If we go back to the example of content being like conversations, imagine if you were talking to somebody every single day, and then all of a sudden you stopped talking to them, and you didn't talk to them for like 2 months. And then you came back and you had like 1 conversation, and then you disappeared again. That would not be a strong or a healthy relationship by anybody's standards. So if you think about that as your audience, do you really want to talk to your audience, only once a month or once a quarter or never? No, you don't. You want to be consistent and reliable. You want to talk to them on a regular basis, which provides all of that. It provides the consistency and the reliability, and that builds trust. It's so important for any brand, whether you're doing 100 pieces a month or you're only doing 4, to be consistent, to, really commit to your content. And I think, quite a lot of brands maybe start with the best intentions, but then, get sidetracked. And that's, another really great example of the benefit that an agency can bring, because you have that dedicated resource that consistently delivers, where when it's done by an in-house team, quite often they get distracted by more immediate fires or bigger problems and think only in the short term and don't think about the long game.
That's such a really good example. And my 100 pieces of content. That's quite a ton of work, and especially like you said in the SaaS space. You actually made me think of a follow-up question, and I think it's an important one, most especially for SaaS, because, again, if we're talking about the sea of sameness, well, SaaS tends to slide right into that pond. What did you do for this particular client, if I may ask, that helped you not only to create this great system and that consistency, but what was it in the content that helped your client to stand out in their space?
Well, I think it's all about the strategy. We see these really great pieces of content and we think that they just appeared, but actually all great content has a foundation, and that piece of content is just the tip of the iceberg. What sits underneath it is, where the real value lies. So, we handled their strategy for them as well, obviously, because that's a really important thing. One of the challenges we often see with brands is they want to keep the strategy in-house. And we always say, okay, sure. But just so you're aware, quite often that is what falls off the bandwagon. They don't commit enough time to creating a strategy, and then the content as a result falls off the bandwagon. So it always works best when we handle the strategy as well as the content production. But for that specific client, we really thought about their audience, and they were trying to target, 1 to 2 people businesses, so very small businesses. And, from a financial perspective, so thinking about all the different aspects and areas that they would need to know about to run a business, and created, a knowledge hub. So we created a whole framework for that content to sit around of, the different areas that their audience would need to know about if they were to run a successful business, like, their marketing, their sales, basic finance stuff, like what is that, all of this stuff that, a small 1-person business who's trying to figure out where they start, what they do. What if you could be that person that they go to? What if you could be that brand that they get all of their best advice and ideas from? So, thinking about it from a value perspective rather than only from a product perspective. So how do you position your company to be that go-to place for your audience, and creating a knowledge hub that really, delivers meaningful, valuable content is, the foundation that allows you to do something like that.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. That expert positioning, right? As the position them as the go-to uh expert, or the hub within that specific niche, right? Okay. You talked about this a little bit in the past couple of minutes, but explain the importance of having the right strategy in conducting the relevant research, because those two definitely go hand in hand. And to your point, you don't just like bang out this B2B content and then wow, it's spot on. And then what about the next one and the next one and the next one? It's all interconnected somehow. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. It is all interconnected because, you need to start having conversations to figure out what the most meaningful conversations are. So, I mean, the first time you go and speak to somebody is a little bit of fumbling around in the dark, because you know maybe a lot about them, but you don't necessarily know what's going to make them, really engaged. So you need to, create content, but then to look at, how that content performs. So there's quite a lot of research that supports doing content audits. And, if you've been producing content for a while, you should do content audits, because they show you where those missed opportunities are. They show you what you're doing well and what you're not doing so well. And, by improving what you're not doing so well, or, what's underperforming, can be a very quick win. You already have some domain authority on that content. You already have some organic traction. So updating that content and keeping it fresh and relevant as well, because, you could have, an article that's driving thousands of impressions every month, but it's from 2008, or, something crazy. So, updating it so that it's relevant, because you want, your conversations to be relevant. You want your content to be relevant. And Google obviously likes that as well. So, one of the things that is really important to do is to do those content audits. And, studies from SEMrush show that brands who are the most successful with their content marketing do content audits at least twice a year. And I would definitely recommend that. It should be a continual iterative process where you set the strategy, create the content, look at the results. It feeds back into the strategy. What a lot of marketing companies tend to do is they don't look at the results. So, a lot of marketing departments aren't so comfortable perhaps with Google Analytics, or, don't know what to do with that data. So they don't actually invest time to look at results, to go back in, to feed through it. But that is so important to do, because it helps you refresh and refine.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. Great. So we get to the part in the conversation where we're talking about actionable tips, and you know what it's like. I mean, a lot of these things cannot be done overnight, but there are some steps that people can take right now to improve what they're doing when it comes to B2B content, right? So, what are some of those steps that B2B marketers can take to start developing content that creates conversations and build relationships? So, some quick wins, and what is it they should focus on?
Yeah. So, I guess it depends on if you are a brand who's already creating content, or if you're starting from ground zero, because obviously, the quick wins are going to be slightly different. One of the things you need to do regardless is make sure that you understand your audience, that you know who you're speaking to, that you have customer avatars. And when I say customer avatars, I mean customer avatars that go beyond just name and role, that dive deep into, what people are thinking about and worried about, and what those psychological triggers are. So thinking about it from that perspective, if you've been creating content, going back and looking at that content to see if it aligns with what you know about your audience and your customers, to see, the qualitative as well as the quantitative results. If you're, starting from ground zero, just get publishing basically. You need to start somewhere. And even if, the first social post or the first article doesn't perform as, it isn't the best thing you've ever written, that's natural and that's to be expected. It takes probably about 6 months to build really good solely organic traction and momentum. So, you have to be doing it consistently. So be patient with yourself. The first thing you do is not going to be perfect. It's going to take time and refinement. It's going to take learning to get to that point, where you have a really loyal following, where you have those strong relationships, where you have all those connections. So give yourself time as well. I feel like a lot of brands are quite often very impatient and, do one post and say, oh, it didn't work. Well, of course it didn't work. It takes time. Be patient. So I would just encourage them to start that journey, and to be really self-aware and to think about what's working, what's not working, to look at the results, and to constantly go back and reflect and refine and review. But get going.
Well, that's some really great advice. And if I understood correctly what you were saying in the past couple of minutes, it's a bit of a combination of different factors, right? Because you've got to have your research, so understanding who it is you're targeting. I like to call it your roadmap or your blueprint, so your strategy, right? Because it's all going to be based on something. And going back to a point you mentioned earlier, like have that system in place, right, to get this, because it has to function like a machine somehow, right? I don't really want to use that term, but I think you know what I'm implying, right? And also finding a way to track, right, to see if it's what you're putting out there is working, because it's also about like, okay, what kind of results are these is this content generating for us, right? And I love the point that you brought up about being patient, because it's almost similar to like podcasting, right? And it's same story, different characters, right? Like there's a lot of companies out there, let's put out a podcast, and suddenly after episode 10 they just lose steam, right? And a lot of it is also because they just didn't really think it through. We're like, okay, so who are we getting on? What are they going to talk about? How does this fit into our overall content plan? Do you actually have a content plan, right, for the podcast, or are you just getting people on and interviewing them about random topics, right? So similar thing. So no, fantastic. Those are some really great points, and it's a great segue into what I was going to ask you next, because we were talking about like trying to track and measure to see if what we're putting out there is working. So are there any specific metrics and attribution that you think B2B marketers should be focusing on to check if their content is generating the right results?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's important to look at, how long somebody spends on page, because, it shows you if they're reading the full article or if they're, just coming on quickly and not finding the information that they want and are leaving. So, that also is shown in bounce rates. Looking at, organic search traction. So, are you ranking on page 1, page 2 for these strategic keywords? Because, good content as well is about being SEO optimized. So, while I'm never about creating content just for SEO's sake, you do want to be integrating SEO, because you do want to show up in front of your audience when they are looking for terms that are highly relevant and very specifically related to your business. You don't want them to be like, okay, I need a content marketing service, and finding a different agency, say in my example. You want them to find you, so that you can be in front of them when they need you most. So it's about thinking about those sorts of metrics and looking at organic site traffic and where your traffic is coming from. Obviously, one of the difficulties with metrics is that it doesn't show the full picture, because, a lot of content sits in the middle funnel. So, if you look at last click attribution, you may not see the blog article in there, because it's about a journey. They're probably not going to read a blog article and become a customer right away, but they probably would, sign up for your newsletter or visit another landing page. So, I think it's important as well to not get completely obsessed with these metrics that Google Analytics and SEMrush shows us. Yes, they are important, but you have to remember they only show part of the picture. It's pretty difficult to use these metrics to track something like brand awareness. Yes, you could rank on page 1, but they're not going to show you the full picture, because they're not going to show you everything that kind of happens in the in-between, in the space between when they find you on the search results and when they buy from you. It's not necessarily going to show you that full picture. So I think as well, metrics are important, but you don't want to get completely bogged down in them. One thing that is important that you can't really track in metrics is when people are saying, oh, I've read that article, it was really great. I mean, how can you track a metric like that? But, that is really valuable as well.
Absolutely. I mean, those were some really great points. I love how you brought up the point about not being too obsessed with the data and with the metrics, because they only tell part of the story, right? Because how often have you read, not naming names, but how often have you read those posts on LinkedIn where people are talking only about data, right? Like, you have to understand what the data is telling you. You have to let the data guide you, let the data lead you. And that's not to say that you completely dismiss that, but to your point, what about the qualitative aspect of this? Because especially when it comes to content, there's a qualitative aspect of this that you also need to consider.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, I think we have to think about it like this. We are humans.
Yeah.
Your audience is humans, and not everything a human does can be tracked and measured. It can't. I mean, you can track your weight, you can track your blood pressure, you can track some of the metrics of being human, but you cannot track all of them.
Absolutely. Okay. And I can't help myself but ask you this next question, because you are in this field, and this tends to be the classic copywriter's question. Quality or quantity? Which one do you think is more important, and why?
I would say neither, and both. So
Okay.
you need both. So, I mean, neither is more important than the other. You need quality, obviously, because quality is about relevancy, and it's about creating content that actually connects with your audience and that talks to your audience and positions you as a thought leader. That's where the quality comes in. But if you don't do that consistently and regularly, it's almost worthless. So if you only do one blog a year, or one every other month, or, you don't do it at all, which is where quantity comes in, then, you're not building that organic momentum we've been talking about. You're not building that traction. So you need both.
That's a great answer, and I think you know where I was going with that one. You've probably seen this online. There's two camps, right? Like, there's two camps, and most people love to be in either or. And I love how you're in neither, and you've basically just created your own camp right now.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen so many brands get dragged down by being too obsessed with one or the other. So, if you create a piece of content and you're so obsessed with it being 110% perfect that it takes you 5 months to publish it, you don't have a content marketing strategy. You don't even have any content marketing because you're not even publishing. I mean, on the other hand, if you only create content for, say, SEO sake, so it's just dry, dull, bland, it doesn't offer anything different.
Just keyword stuffing, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that hits a quantity, but also doesn't help you because you're not actually benefiting your brand. You're just creating content for content's sake, which shouldn't be done. Instead, if you think about content as a conversation, you want to have regular conversations with people you care about, and you want to have meaningful ones. If you just had very surface level conversations with people you cared about, you probably actually wouldn't care about them. You actually wouldn't have that connection. So it's really about, if you think about it from a relationship point of view, it's really about having consistent, regular communication that gets beneath the surface, that is deeper than just what's the weather.
Yeah. No, fantastic. Kathryn, we could have gone on for another 5 hours here. I mean, you have unpacked so much in our conversation. I mean, that is of incredible value. You've helped to break it down into its parts and make it and I think that was also the objective of the exercise: make it digestible, relatable, and ultimately it's our hope that it's actionable, right? So thanks again for coming on the show, and quick intro to yourself and how people can get in touch with you.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Kathryn Strachen, the managing director and founder of Copy House. Coffeehouse is a content marketing agency specializing in technology and fintech. You can find me on LinkedIn. I love connecting with people on LinkedIn and find out more about some of my thoughts because I share my content regularly. Or you can visit our website, copyhouse.io, and find out more about our services and what we do for our clients.
Fantastic. Once again, thank you so much for coming on the show. Take care, stay safe, and talk to you soon.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. All right. Bye for now.